At the beginning of the movie, U.S. soldiers are seen fighting and losing a brutal war in Vietnam in 1966. Daniel Ellsberg, a young military analyst, joins U.S. troops to analyze their stance and witnesses firsthand the harsh realities and chaos of combat. As he and the troops navigate through the dense jungles and small villages in Vietnam, Daniel faces the reality of his country's loss, which is opposite to what the government has officially been reporting to the public. On his way back to the States, Daniel gives his negative analysis of the situation in Vietnam to the Secretary of State, Robert McNamara, who seems to agree with Daniel on the grim reality of the U.S. soldiers and the hopelessness of the war. However, Daniel is shocked to later hear Robert announce to the public on how well the troops are doing and how much he supports the cause, and starts to question the extent of the government's involvement and its true motives. After returning to the U.S., Daniel joined Rand Corporation, a prestigious firm that advises the government on defense strategy and policy. Despite his success, Daniel's experiences in Vietnam continue to haunt him. He then uses his position at Rand to access confidential files and information from the firm, and uses the following years to steal and compile it to make personal copies. Meanwhile, in Washington, Katharine Graham, socialite and new first female publisher of the Washington Post newspaper, a small local newspaper that was conceived by her late father, struggles to compete with rivalries like the New York Times and keep her small family business afloat after the suicide of her husband and former publisher, Phil Graham. She then makes bold decisions by hiring the dynamic Ben Bradley, who shares her vision for the company, to make it a quality-centered press with national relevance, as the head editor. She also proposes to the board of the newspaper to take the company public and sell shares. The board undermines her as just a woman who's no more than just a housewife who can entertain her important friends and resist. She relies on Ben to guide her to take the right steps that can take the paper to the heights she dreams of. A few years later, in 1971, Daniel finally finished collecting all the necessary documents. He then compiles it and sends it to Neil Sheehan, a journalist at the New York Times. A few days later, Robert, who is a close friend of Katharine, calls and warns her that there will be an unflattering piece on him published in the New York Times the next day, without elaborating further. She supports him and tells him that she will be there for him no matter what. The next day, the nation is shocked to its core to learn from the New York Times that the U.S. government has been deceiving both them and Congress about the situation of its troops in Vietnam and of its political and military involvement in Vietnam for the last 3 decades, going as far back as the Truman administration. Following the revelation, people take to the streets to demand answers and furiously protest the war, while Ben, frustrated to be beaten to such a story, frantically searches for the source of it, hoping to somehow top the story. Then out of nowhere, a mysterious lady brings detailed pages of the leaked study to the Washington Post and leaves it on one of the journalist's desks. Frantic, the journalist takes it to Ben, who's excited by the discovery. He distributes it to his reporters to proofread and prepares it to be printed the next day. Unfortunately, his excitement is short-lived, as he discovers that the New York Times also got the same story and is in the process of printing it. He curses his luck and redirects his focus to finding the origin of the leak. The United States President Nixon, called the Attorney General and asked him to impose an injunction on the New York Times on the grounds of treason, and declared the paper his enemy. On the other side of the city, Katharine dines with her friends, Abe Rosenthal, publisher of the New York Times, and his wife. While the trio enjoys their meal and chit-chat about current events, Abe is informed by one of his reporters about the injunction and that President Nixon is taking the New York Times to court. Katharine excuses herself and calls Ben to inform him of the recent developments, and emphasizes that he should stop looking into the leaked story, which has come to be known as the Pentagon Papers, as they can no longer legally publish it due to the injunction. However, Ben doesn't heed her warning and encourages his staff to find the source of the story as soon as possible. The Washington Post's assistant editor, Ben Bagdikian, follows his hunch in finding the source that directs him on the right path of his former co-worker at Rand, Daniel. He searches for him vigorously, and just as he is about to give up, he finds him at the International Center for Research and contacts him. Daniel remembers him and sets an appointment to see him at a motel in Boston the next night. Elsewhere, Katharine manages to convince the Washington Post board to go public and start selling shares, makes this official by going to the stock exchange market and joining the other members of the stock at a meeting where they congratulate and welcome her. Ben Bagdikian goes to Daniel's motel and is stunned to see the magnitude and depth of the documents the whistleblower has accumulated. The 46 volumes of the confidential study detail the harrowing facts and blunders of the United States government, from rigging elections to provoking wars. Daniel narrates how long it took him to covertly gather all the information. He goes on to explain that even though he knows it's dangerous to expose the government in this manner, he couldn't stand to look the other way, and that the guilt of knowing that the reason that many of the young boys were sent to die in the battlefield held were purely for appearances and to avoid the perception of an American defeat, while those in power knew that the war was hopeless and there was no way to victory. Ben Bagdikian promises Daniel that his sacrifices won't be for nothing and that the Washington Post will publish the document despite the injunction. He then calls his boss, Ben Bradley, and informs him of his discovery. Ben Bradley tells Ben Bagdikian to be on the first flight out of Boston with the documents and rushes over to Catherine. He gets to Catherine's house and interrupts her birthday party to inform her of Ben Bagdikian's status and raise the issue that makes her question the morality and nature of her friendships with the socialites of the nation, especially those accused of the crime detailed in the New York Times. She tries to defend her friends, but Ben Bradley is not convinced and reminisces regretfully about his old friendship with the Kennedys and how questionable it was in retrospect. The next day, Catherine goes to see her dear friend and former state attorney Robert, hoping for some kind of explanation that would make sense and excuse all the cruelty he and the government were accused of and to inform him of her potential involvement in it being published. She confronts him with how he could let her son and all the young boys of the nation go to war knowing they could never win, how he could let it go on for so long, and asks at what cost. Robert tries to defend his actions, saying he was only trying to do what was best at the time, and that now, while they're still in the middle of the war, is not the right time to evaluate the strategies of it. Catherine is disappointed and leaves after giving him a heads up about a potentially related story coming up in her papers. The next morning, Ben Bagdikian arrives in Washington with the documents and goes to Ben Bradley's house, where senior editors of the paper were gathered waiting for him with anticipation. There, Ben Bradley's wife graciously hosts them. They lay all the documents down and start to go through and organize all the 4,000 pages of the study to make it to the print deadline for the next day. Meanwhile, Catherine is interrupted and informed of the progress made by Ben and his staff at a party she's hosting to honor one of her dear friends. Board members attending the party overhear this and panic. They take Catherine aside and urge her to put a stop to it, as it could damage the paper beyond repair if President Nixon decides to sue it and the court finds it in contempt. Catherine hears all their arguments, takes time out to evaluate what this would mean to the nation, and thinks of all those boys fighting for a lost cause. She goes deeper and considers what her late husband would have done. She then makes another bold decision to go ahead and print the story. Ben Bradley, together with his reporters, are delighted, while the board members are anxious and suggest that she change her mind so that her investors won't pull out of investing in the paper and buying shares. However, Catherine stands by her decision. Back at Ben Bradley's house, the reporters scramble and manage to prepare the document for print and send it on its way. Ben Bagdikian returns to the office to supervise the printing and is met by the Washington Post's in-house lawyers, who demand to know who his source is and whether he took the document from the New York Times following their injunction. Ben refuses to reveal his source, but assures them that he has no contact with the New York Times. Moments later, the lawyers return after delving further into the legalities of the matter. They ask and shock Ben by informing him that if his source turns out to be the same as the New York Times, it can be viewed as being directly in contempt of court and can result in serious legal consequences. Meanwhile, back in Ben Bradley's house, Ben discusses the decision to print with his wife, who finds it very brave of Catherine. She explains to Ben how much Catherine has to lose and how hard it must have been for her to lead the company surrounded by people who undermine her and her opinions because of her gender, and how brave it is of her to stake all her fortune, friends, and reputation to fight for what's right. This hits Ben Bradley hard and makes him doubt his decision to push Catherine to publish the story. While Ben Bradley contemplates this, he receives a call from the panicked Ben Bagdikian to tell him of the possible legal outcome he had just learned about. Ben Bradley rushes to Catherine's house to regretfully inform her of the situation. They call the board members and lawyers to Catherine's house and try to decide their next move, whether they should go ahead with the print or halt it to stay safe from the consequences. Catherine thinks hard and deeply, and after considering all the options and possible consequences, she shuts down all the board members who question her decision-making, reminds them that this is her company, and decides to go ahead with the printing to the delight of Ben Bradley. The lawyers get to work so they can have a fighting chance against the full might of the U.S. government. Ben Bradley calls the printing press and gives the final go-ahead. The story is run and makes it to the public by the morning. At mid-morning, the U.S. Attorney General calls the Washington Post and asks them to stop running the story. Ben Bradley respectfully declines. Later that day, the Washington Post received official letters from the U.S. government to appear in court along with the New York Times. As they prepare their court case, Ben Bradley and Catherine learn that all newspapers around the nation have run the same story to show their solidarity with them, which warms them. They appear in the Supreme Court a few days later, charged under the Espionage Act, claiming the published material endangers the country's political interest and defense. While they prepare their defense around the protection of the First Amendment, the whole nation holds its breath and watches as the session that has the potential to change the course of the nation's history commences. Both sides present their arguments and leave until the judges and Congress reach a decision. Later, the Washington Post is informed at its office that Congress has voted 6-3 in their favor. The Supreme Court judge goes further and states that the press is for the governed people and not for the governors. Everyone at the Washington Post, including Ben Bradlee and Catherine, are delighted and breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Washington Post becomes popular, which attracts the investors back. Catherine and Ben Bradlee take time out to evaluate the momentous moment that shaped history on the right path by asserting the freedom of the press. Subsequently, President Nixon bans journalists of the Washington Post from ever entering the White House. In the epilogue, a security guard calls the police to report a burglary at the Watergate, hinting at the discovery of the Watergate scandal. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.